Welcome back to our discussion, How Government Contracting Policies Impact National Security, sponsored by George Mason University here on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. I'm Tom Temin. My guest today is Dr. Jerry McGinn, Executive Director of the Center for Government Contracting in the School of Business at George Mason University. And let's talk about national security for a minute. This whole Huawei business, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, there's a lot of ferment going on here.
Indeed.
What do you make of it all?
Yeah, I know CFIUS, or the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, is not a disease, as that was one of the first things we would say when I was in government. It was the most classified work that I dealt with when I was in government, and it is incredibly important because what CFIUS does is foreign investment is a critical thing in the United States. You know, the U.S. government supports it, the Department of Defense supports it, but each of these transactions have to be reviewed to see what their impact is on national security. So when there's a transaction, a foreign company buys a U.S. property or does a major investment in above certain, that's where CFIUS kicks in. And what the review is about is the national security implications of this transaction. And then when you look at prior to about 2010, about 95% of the transactions before the committee were involving NATO countries or Japan, Australia, South Korea, which are close allies that we operate with every day. But since in the last several years, a tremendous number of transactions have come from Asia, particularly from China, to over 35% of the transactions in recent years. And those are very much more complex, and because the Chinese government has stated that they want their companies to do things like work on artificial intelligence and robotics and the like, and those are inherently sensitive areas. So you've seen that with the transactions involving Chinese companies, and that really comes home with companies like Huawei and ZTE.
Yeah, I mean, this has always been a concern. I remember, I guess it was in the 80s, that there was concern that Japanese real estate interests acquired Rockefeller Center and all the car business that happened then. But that was primarily economic.
Right.
No one thought Japan was a threat to the United States, but Chinese investment brings a different shade to it in the sense of they are an economic competitor, but also a major military and almost empire competitor.
Yes, yeah, no, it is inherently that way, and particularly when they're dealing with our networks on which our national defense systems operate. So having those run on routers or systems that are Chinese origin, when the Chinese government, by publicly declared law, has the ability to tell the companies to turn over their investment, turn over their kit to the Chinese government, that's inherently a national security issue for the U.S.
Sure, and also Russia, because there was the software deals with Russia and the security software that was on federal systems. At what point, and how do you convey this? At what point does it become this is something beyond the contracting officer or this particular shop that's buying and becomes an issue where Congress gets involved and where it really gets to be a policy issue and not just an acquisition issue on the spot?
And you have seen this, and that's a great question, Tom. You've seen this with the recent law that was passed in 2018 on that modernized the CFIUS process. It was the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, I believe, FIRMA, and that was about changing the way in which we look at foreign investment, because previously it was focusing on things like support security and and real estate transactions, but it didn't really get at some of these areas which are advanced technologies, so that's where the law needed to be modernized, and Congress, and I testified before Congress in closed session, and a lot of my colleagues in the department, former colleagues, did as well across the government, and the Congress agreed, and they changed the law. And what it did, it allows U.S. government actually to operate, to coordinate with allies on these kind of business dealings, to understand what the risks are to national security and international security. So, that was a good, in my view, a good illustration of a cooperative effort between the branches of government to address the national security issue in the contracting.
Yeah, in fact, it takes funny turns when Chinese interests bought the Waldorf Astoria.
Yeah.
Suddenly our delegations to the UN couldn't stay there anymore because who knows what they were putting in the walls during the renovation.
The ambassador used to live there, I believe, right?
Well, I believe so, yeah, at least during the UN sessions. Yeah, no more had to move out. And Let's talk about the NDAAs. Those have always been a vehicle for a lot of procurement acquisition changes, not only just the DoD side, but they slip in a lot of civilian things there too.
Yeah, indeed.
A little bit less this time around for 2020, so far as we can tell. What's your take on NDAA activity, and what are you expecting?
I'm not expecting as much because the committees, both the Senate and the House, have been tremendously active under former Chairman Thornberry and former Chairman, the late John McCain, on doing acquisition reform. And those efforts have given the Department of Defense lots of activities to work on, in middle tier acquisition, on small business reform, on rapid acquisition, rapid prototyping. And it is hard for the department to digest these, and it's hard for any government agency to digest them rapidly. So, and government moves slow at the best of times, and my former colleagues in government would agree with that. But so they've sort of, I think, the department and other agencies have said, let's pause a little bit, and we're going to keep working on with you to implement the provisions you've given us, the authorities, and we'll see how those work. At least that's been the argument.
And the big picture really for DoD is this pivot from the emphases they've had for the past 20 years to the big power competition, return to big power competition.
That's correct.
Overlaid on that is their perceived need, and probably a real need, for a new round of offset in technology. Those are the ultimate challenges that we have right now, besides readiness and day-to-day issues.
Right.
Briefly, do you feel that their acquisition systems and initiatives are aligned with those two needs, the offset and the great powers competition?
Well, I think that they're putting all their efforts towards those ends. Now, whether the system right now it is not necessarily optimized to do those kind of things, which is why they're doing these like middle tier acquisition and OTs and the like. And the question is will these get them far enough, or do they need to do more? And those are the kind of research issues that my center is looking to tackle, and the kind of things that the government is trying to figure out and industry is trying to support. So I think it's an open question, I think, Tom, for at least a short run. But I think that that's the direction they're heading, and I think that I think it's important for the whole the government contracting community to move in that direction.
All right. Well, thank you for all the work you're doing, and thanks for being with us today.
Great. Well, it's a real pleasure. Great to meet you.
My guest today has been Dr. Jerry McGinn, Executive Director of the Center for Government Contracting in the School of Business at George Mason University. I'm Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search George Mason.